everybody. Again, another version of Unplugged, where we introduce one of the OTC consultants to you. And I'm sure today you're going to enjoy this discussion with me. I have no idea what we're going to talk about. We will see where it leads to. But with that, I want to say hello and welcome to Petrus Scholtz.
Hi, Wilmien. It's a pleasure talking to you.
And we're going to journey and we're going to see where this journey takes us today.
Let's see.
Petrus, it's always good to tell people a little bit about yourself. So tell me a few things. A little bit where you grew up, a little bit where you've ended up, a little bit where you started, but we can take it bit by bit. So tell me what happened in your children years, your childhood.
Okay, I started off quite far north in the continent, in Rhodesia of those days. I was born in a little town called Rusapi on the eastern highlands of Rhodesia. My parents were out there on a locum job at the time from South Africa, but my mother's side of the family is basically from Umtali area. So my grandparents left after the Boer War, decided to get out of the English colony and moved out to Rhodesia and started farming on the eastern highlands above Umtali. Actually, from our family farm, you could see Beira on a clear day. So that's where I started life.
Today, cool. What did they farm? What did they farm?
Cattle.
Cattle, okay.
It was a big cattle farm, and of course leopards were a big problem at the time. My grandfather was a very famous leopard hunter in those days. Hunted for a lot of his neighbors as well. So yeah, I think that's where maybe got into my blood as well. Not leopards, but more the other stuff. So we left very early from there when the locum job ran out and moved to a small little town called Brighton, close to Ermelo. Now, these days, the road goes past Brighton. You have to make an effort to get into Brighton. And it's really very, very small. The only other famous thing about Brighton is Naas Botha grew up there as well. If that's anything to go by. Spent about 9 years in Brighton. My father was a pharmacist. And then he decided he wanted to move to greener pastures. And we bought a property in Hartenbos. Just an empty piece of land. So when I was 9 years old, we moved down to Mossel Bay, actually Hartenbos at that time, and started building this new pharmacy out there. It was a block of basically 6 flats and the pharmacy building itself. Knew nothing about building, but he started building there, took the bull by the horns, and then just took it from there. Every day after school, I'd be up on the slabs and tying, reinforcing, and so we got involved in the business very, very early. We opened the doors that December. That was in '69. I just turned 9 at that point in time, and we started working in the pharmacy. Every holiday, it was harvesting time, so we all had to work. All the kids were in there, and those days it wasn't seen as child labor; it was seen as growing up your children.
I still believe in child labor, but my version of child labor, not the awful one that we hear from in other countries. Were you an only child, Beatrice?
We were 3 kids. I was the oldest, and then my brother 3 years younger, and my sister 4 years younger than me.
So I just want to interrupt you there, Rick. Your dad was a pharmacist, so that reminds me a bit. Is that where the love of chemicals come in? A different application, being a chemical engineer than a pharmacist, but...
I wanted to study medicine initially, and we had one big problem growing up in Mossel Bay. It was the triple S, die son, die sand, and die see. And that...
In English, it will also work, huh? Sun, sand, and sea. It will actually work in English as well.
Yeah, that was the first problem. And the second problem was in those days, standard 8 and standard 9. Each year we had 4 math teachers. New one every quarter. And then matric we had the vice headmaster as our teacher, and he was more in the office than in the class. So we had 3 years of very, very bad maths tutoring, which resulted in me having very, very low maths grades. And when I got into university, also coming from the Western Cape, we didn't know anything about calculus in those days. That was not even in our vocabulary. So when I got to university and I started off with a refreshing course of calculus, I didn't know what the hell they were talking about. So my
But
first year was a disaster.
But it sounds like this is your reason for not doing medical, but you've done engineering, which has more maths and calculus than medical would have.
Yeah, that goes further. I finished matric in Mosselbaai, as I said, then moved on to Pretoria. My father bought a farm in Bronkhorstspruit at the time, and Pretoria obviously was quite close to Bronkhorstspruit, and that was an obvious university to go to. So the first year I then enrolled into BMedSci, which was not true BSc sciences. It also had biological sciences with that as well. And with this whole disaster on the math side, it also, of course, went over to physics. Calculus was just as important as the physics side, so that was a disaster for me. But at the end of the day, I ended up with and I must say this, I had an E for my maths in matric. So, I mean, that is, coming from an A in standard 7 to an E in matric was a bit of a disappointment to everybody. So I finished my matric with an E in maths because of all these many teachers we've had, and maybe a lack of interest because of that as well. But even so, I managed to get a 49 for my first year. Now, I was only 17 at the time. I turned 18 in end of October of my first year. So we were still from an era where you could go to school when you were 5. I decided, okay, maybe university is not my career. And I opted then to go and do my army and finish that, and then see where my life is going to take me. So I did my 2 years of military training, compulsory military training. First year was in Oudtshoorn, and a junior leadership course. And from there, I went into an intelligence course, and I did then, I was an intelligence officer at the Northern Command headquarters in Pretoria for the next second year, which was very interesting. Then I could take the areas of Mozambique and Rhodesia at the time, because I came from Rhodesia. It was an interesting area for me, and I managed then to service that area from the intelligence point of view. So after basically the end of my second year, I did all these psychological tests and see what can I do, and results came back. You can do whatever you want to do. That doesn't help me very much. But I decided, okay, I'm going to do civil engineering. I like building stuff, and I like bridges and all of that. So we enrolled, I got accepted. With that, maybe that almost pass in maths got me through. And yeah, then we sat there today and we were filling in all these forms at the registration. They looked at us and said, civil, but I passed chemistry. Maybe I should just change to chemical engineering rather than civil engineering. And on that whim, I went to go and see Ois Grimsdale, the department head, and he said, of course, come on, we'll change you next year. You'll enroll as civils, it's the same subjects. I passed physics through UNISA in my second year in the army, so at least I got that under the belt, and got accepted in chemical engineering. The University of Pretoria had a program then for the military leavers, and we had a 2-week crash course on maths, and just to bring us back to speed again. After 2 years of lapsing, you were a bit far behind. Got a fantastic woman lecturer, Anna Marie. I can't remember her surname now for the life of me. But she was a phenomenal woman. The first day we all enrolled in a class, she said, okay, I want your picture tomorrow with your course you're doing, your name, all of that in the back. So next day we handed that in, and we were about a class of 130 that came from the army at that point in time. The day after that, we would sit in the class, we would point each and every one of us by name, call you out, say, okay, you're doing that now, so what do you think about this question, what do you think about that one? And that just woke me up. This woman knew me now by name, and this is no longer sitting out there just hiding in the crowd. And that got me to the end of the first year, 93 in maths, and it was all due to Anne-Marie. It was just it showed me how a tutor can change your life.
Oh, Beatrice, there's so many things I want to say and respond to that. It excites me. I'm busy with a whole series of other things that I'm talking about our potential in life and how you must be so careful that if something early in your life showed you a certain potential, to not think that is your final potential that you're going to reach. And exactly, I mean, an E at maths due to circumstances, but that is what everyone would have pitched you at, and maybe you pitched yourself at that at a stage too. And then all of a sudden, with the right inputs to 93, I'm very excited when I hear real life stories like that. And with that also, the impact a teacher can have. The other day we had dinner with friends, where the one guy also explained that his one teacher, maths teacher, looked at him and said, "You will never achieve anything in your life. You're a loser." And for many years, he acted like that until one teacher came and said, "I bet you can do it," and believed in him. And he did it. And what a difference it made. There's nothing like teachers or lecturers or things that can make or break you in life, hey?
Yeah, absolutely.
But can they really break you, or is it something we can do on our side to push through?
I think that if you don't have somebody believing in you as well, you start to lose faith in yourself. And the alternative, so it's not that they break you, but they don't allow the fertile soil to grow into.
Yes. They prune too much.
You just wilt at the end of the day. Whereas if you give the fertile soil and your support and belief in you, that just increases your own faith in yourself. And then also you try to please them. You don't want to disappoint them. And you try a bit harder. I think that's where it comes from. You see it in your children as well. And I don't think we ever raise our children exactly the same. We think they come from the same household, they exactly got the same background, all of that, but no. They've got their own personalities, and you react according to their personalities as well. And that makes a difference to them.
Oh no, I love that story, and I realize that we've sort of jumped from your time building the pharmacy in Hartenbos to another part of your life, but I love how these stories just develop and have a life of its own. Anything else from your childhood you want to share?
My childhood, I think Mossel Bay was a fantastic place to grow up in. We actually got to return to Mossel Bay, or close to Mossel Bay, hopefully soon, as soon as we got our house sold. It's just a fantastic part of the world. There's so much to do out there, so much to see. The weather is supposedly next to Vancouver, the most gematigd, even climate in the world, according to the Guinness Book of Records. Well, my family that moved there says it is not true. Maybe if you look at the extremes, and the average of that extreme is quite nice, but the extremes are these days quite phenomenal. So it's no longer that moderate out there. We have seen some that as well.
Yeah, I say that humans have learned how to control many, many things, but one thing we cannot control is the weather. That one is still out there.
And out there, you make sure you've got the kacheltjie, so you can make your fire and get a nice bottle of port and a nice fire going, and that will get you through the winter evenings.
Get you through the extreme weather. And what do you do in the heat then, if that is your solution for the cold?
You go double glazing. We go with technology.
Yeah, So, Petrus, tell me, you've. Oh, sorry. What did you want to say?
About my early childhood, growing up in the pharmacy as well. We had a double license in the pharmacy. One was the pharmacy license, the other one was a general dealer. And in that Hartbeespoort area in those years, go back to the late 60s, early 70s, we didn't have malls, we didn't have big shopping centers. There was nothing like that. It was all small businesses. And Hartbeespoort was a holiday destination. So we had 65,000 visitors a year to Mossel Bay. And they would all come and buy their Christmas gifts down there, and their beach wear and all the beach stuff. So the general dealer had something from anything. As we always say, van die kerkrot tot 'n dooie policeman. And
what did you learn being part of that?
Was quite, being a pharmacist was his one side. He was also a businessman. He undertook trips to Hong Kong in those days to go and find sources of beachwear and beach stuff, lilos, these ping pong rackets. And with the local wholesalers in those days, we as kids would go along with them when they visited the wholesalers. And then my job was to go out there at that early age, say, okay, what would you like as a gift? And I would go and select stuff out there and say, I think this is nice to play with, that is good. And then we'd buy that, and that would go on the shelves, and we would be the only ones having that on the shelves. And it would fly off the shelves. And I think that's where I got involved in marketing and sales and very, very early day and business principles. I was not, at that point in time, 10 years old, doing buying for a big pharmacy area. And we didn't think anything about it. It was just what we did. It was a way of growing up. We got very early on, we got some of these epoxy kits, and we made little surfboards and amulets and pendants with little shells and seaweed inside, and sold them, polished them off, and made little hangertjies, and that was then always sold as gifts. Again, giving me some business acumen. So I think from the early days, that was what really made me tick. Going to the varsity, I was the social leader in my class for many years, too many years actually.
So we're going to rope you in at OTC when we need to organize some socials, hey, to lead on that front.
Once again, environment, I'm not a physically big person. So going back to school, was very, very early into school, 5 years, just turned 5 when I went to school. And I was small and very often bullied as well, which turned me very much into an introvert. I was a shy one, the real nerd out there. Didn't have good eyesight. All didn't help in ball games and all that. So you end up being maybe on the other side of the fence there. Army days, first year in Oudtshoorn, taught me a lot about myself, what you can do, what you can stand up to, and what you don't want to be. And that was also a big thing I learned. And then in the second year as well, I think the Army shaped me to a large extent, where today I don't think people will believe me when I say I was an introvert, a total nerd introvert. And you can change. And I think that is important to understand as well. The more you learn about yourself, the more you can change yourself.
Beatrice, my varsity friends as well, when they hear now I'm doing coaching and I'm reaching out to people and I love to work with people, they shake their heads because it's a different person that I'm now than when I'm there. I was tall and big always, but I was also an introvert for different reasons. Now, it's so funny how we can, for different reasons, have the similar experiences at school. And I was scared of I was so scared of people, and now I love people and I love to interact with them. So sometimes we must just grow up, hey?
That's all it needs. And you need to practice and get confidence. And that comes with practice as well. I remember my first conference I addressed. I was petrified. I was almost frozen on the spot. Sitting here in my throat. I couldn't get the words out, and it was unbelievable. And it got a lot easier over time. And you could address big groups without much of a problem. You just have to tell yourself, they know less than you do. So you can coach them. So they need to listen to you. And you just tell yourself that over and over again, and then you start to build up the confidence as well and say, they're here to come and listen. They're not better than you are. They need to learn as well.
And it's also to overcome that idea, I need to do it perfectly. I don't have to do it perfectly. I must just do it. And then if it's slightly better than the next, it's fine. But I think sometimes that whole feeling of it must be so smooth and perfect is what keeps us sometimes to have the confidence to do anything.
And then you have to sit back as well and say, the crowd in front of you don't have the confidence to go come and stand up here. And you have to motivate yourself in that way as well.
True, absolutely true. So, Beatrice, we talked a little bit about university, but tell me a little bit about the work environment that you got yourself into.
I started off with Mr. Louis Leit's company, Triumph Fertilizer, and that was in Kloorkop. Now, Triumph is again one of these nice businessmen. He made beer as well, very, very good beer. And my favorite beer at the time was Colt 45. It was a phenomenal beer. And then SA Brewery bought him out and closed it down. It was a bad day, sad day to say the least. But yeah, so I started with Rui, and when he sold off all his business at that point in time, he also sold out the Kleurkop factory to Kainach. So I then actually worked for Kainach Fertilizers. And I was employed initially to do the development work on liquid fertilizers. We started off with the clear liquid fertilizer, UAN, urea ammonium nitrate. And after that, we did slurries. We used attapulgite clay to keep them in suspension. Very interesting stuff to do. The reaction with ammonia and with ammonium nitrate and urea. And I remember the reactor we built there. It was a pilot reactor. And when we pumped it two together, the whole reactor was starting to rumble and it was shaking and the steam was coming out the top. The reaction was actually so violent, we got frightened by it. You do it on lab scale until you build the first pilot plant. And you say, oopsie, we need to be a little bit more careful here. But it worked out very well. And I was actually, last week, I was out in the South Free State at the Van der Kloof area. And there's a lot of irrigation farmers out there. And each and every one of them has a row of massive JoJo tanks with a liquid fertilizer that gets pumped into the irrigation system. So that is now standard practice. So, and this was 45 years ago that we did this. And it's actually nice when I got there and I see my earlier handiwork has now also gone right through the country, and it's out there. And it's as I say, standard practice. So I started off with that, and very quickly, but after the first year, the project was done, all the homework was done, and I was actually working myself out of work there. And I thought I was underpaid, maybe not at the time, but I think I got 635 rand a month as a graduate engineer. With transport from, I stayed in Pretoria at the time, in Sunnyside, and driving up and down, that made quite a dent in my bit of salary that I had. And after paying 300 the flat, there wasn't a lot left. So I looked around and I got a job at Natref, the inland refinery in Sasolburg, as a refinery planning engineer, which was a little bit awkward as well. I knew nothing about the refineries other than I'd learned at varsity. And I suddenly became the planning engineer, running an LP model, determining what the plant is going to do and how and what, when, and how every plant is going to run. The nice thing about that, it gave me tremendous insight in the economics of a refinery and how you can change it, how you can manipulate it, and by changing it, what your product qualities would become like. And in later years, that was extremely important in my heating fuel business. But that was a very nice thing. I did that for about 2 years, and then I moved on to process engineering, became plant engineer. We had, in those days, we would do both the technical, let's call it theoretical technical work, as well as looking after the plant side as an engineer. And I eventually migrated into the hydro treating system or section, where I looked after the hydrogen plant, the platformer, everything that had any links to the hydrogen, your reformers, the crackers, and Natref being for the time a very modern refinery. We had both a distillate hydrocracker as well as a black oil hydrocracker, which was later then changed to reduced crude oil desulfurizer. And that was all high pressure, high temperature equipment, running at 185 bar, 450 degrees centigrade, robust, heavy stuff. I enjoyed that a lot. I did that right up to my end in Natref. Close to 96, 95. I attended a visit to Japan for the catalyst. I was also in charge of all the catalyst purchases at the refinery. And we looked at catalyst development with CCIC. That was a catalyst chemical and in the industries company, part of the Nishi Y group in Japan. And we did a tour through all their facilities in Japan. And while we were doing that, one of our senior managers went along, Leon Walliser, turned to me one day and said, "You shouldn't be in technical, you should go to marketing." Okay. And Sasol in those days had what they called a planning room for all the engineers. So you would get lined up for different positions, and suddenly I got called for an interview to go to Sasol Fuel Oil. I didn't ask for it, I was just called, and this was part of the planning room. And I got a job at Sasol Fuel Oil then. And initially it was to do only marketing. And then very soon after that, one lady engineer, she left, and she was in charge of the product development. So we didn't have anybody at the time, so I was just given that as well. And nobody else was appointed to that. So I carried on for 3 years doing the product development as well as the marketing side. And it was quite nice because looking at from a Sasol point of view, doing fuel oil, Sasol is not in the business to produce fuel oils. So we used all the byproducts, the products that didn't have a proper home, out of specification materials, everything you're not supposed to plan for ended up in the fuel oil pool. But then the fuel oil grew to a decent business that needed feedstock. And you had to plan for it, but you weren't allowed to plan for it in your budget phase. That was quite interesting, finding materials within the group, Natref, Sasol One, used in the fuel oil environment. And that's when the Natref experience became very important in terms of the value chain. We could uncover products from the refineries. I could determine the values with the guys on the site. Say, okay, fine, we'll do better than that. That's your alternative. You can dump it on the Sasol dump sites, or we can pay you something for it, or you can pay me to take it. And we would move it into the fuel oils, do some blending. And that was a very nice training ground as well of just thinking out of the box. What do you do with waste? And enhancing the waste and adding value to that. So one of my customers was FFS Refiners at the time, and I enjoyed what they were doing and the innovative way that they were looking at markets and product supply. Was they would scrape the barrel for anything I could find. And eventually I approached them and I said, okay, fine, they want a hole, or they've got a hole, and I'm welcome to come over. So I joined them, which was an interesting one. Was at the time, Sasol had a 49% interest in FFS, and I wasn't allowed to resign. I said, but how can you not allow me to resign? No, you can't. It was just no, you can't. So I had to negotiate to resign from Sasol to start with FFS.
But that is an interesting thing, hey, because normally people go from smaller companies to big corporates. Here you went from a big corporate to a much smaller company.
But it's one of those things, a small fish in a small pond is much better than a big fish in a very, very large pond.
Ek hoor jou. Yeah.
So that's very interesting. Eventually we got to an agreement where I had to find a replacement for myself at Sasol Oil, which I eventually did. And then I was allowed to leave Sasol and start with FFS. And that was a nice journey as well. FFS at the time was basically a waste company. There were agreements that they would take all of Sasol's unutilized waste. So FFS was also cleaning up the dams for Sasol at the time in Secunda. They were doing a cleanup of the coal tars. Messy operations, but innovative systems, innovative filtration systems, very innovative dewatering systems, done by a small group of engineers, I think 5 people in total, and a draftsman. So, punching way above its weight class. Yeah, so we grew the company from a very small base to really a serious company. I had free rein to talk to any of the oil companies, to dislodge material from the oil companies, negotiate with them for the raw materials, volumes, everything. And I think the loveliest thing about FFS was that I had the full responsibility and responsibility and also accountability to make decisions on the company's behalf in a meeting, and I would get the support as long as it was sound, and they trusted me at the time. So we were able to move very, very fast. Get to a conclusion in a meeting, get the pricing sorted out, get the volume sorted out, and then sign it off and carry on. And that was what was very nice for me about the smaller company. Just the speed of operation, innovativeness of that, taking niche little small streams, seeing what you can do with that, upgrading it a little bit, building a quick small plant to do that, take the ash out of it by centrifuging or filtration or whatever, small little niche plant, and you've got a small volume, 300, 400 tons a month, but it matches a market of that size. And we had a motto, fit for purpose fuels. So it was, if you needed a rough and tough product, like an asphalt plant, for instance, that fires over aggregate, you definitely don't need paraffin for that. You've got baghouses at the back taking care of all the ash coming from the aggregate. So why use a low ash material? Supply them with a high ash product at a lower price. And the sum works for everybody. And that was what was fantastic there as well. We could match product streams with markets. And then everybody had some benefit out of it.
Beatrice, I want to talk a little bit about what you said earlier, where you started in that liquid fertilizer, making that, which was quite a new concept in the country. Not many people were using it. Now, 40 years later, you see that it's actually standard practice. So I'm just wondering, is there anything currently that you are working on that might be new, that you think is going to become standard practice in a few years' time?
Well, I think one of them is the one that we're doing with OTC as well. It's not that new, but it's been tried a lot of times now, and that's again the waste, the plastics to oils. I really think that's going to take off and grow. There's a lot of interest in it from various organizations. There's a lot of challenges around it. It's definitely going to take off going forward. We have the challenges in terms of product qualities and where you go with those materials, how much you spend in adding value to them, or we just use it as a raw material going forward. But I think that it's a field that's going to see a lot of development going forward, and we need to do something about all the plastics in the country, in the world, actually. I think what's going to come from this eventually is that we'll have to replace plastics with something more biodegradable. And that is another innovation area where there's a lot of activities at the moment. We haven't seen too much of it coming to fruit, but I think that's going to be an area that's going to develop a lot going forward.
Right. And then another question that I've had from our discussion is, you said in FFS, you really like that you can make the decision and implement it and go fast and furious almost with that through to the end. Two questions. One, what frustrates you currently that goes too slow? And two, what other fast things are you busy with implementing?
Yeah, my personal life is selling my house.
That is frustrating. My mum is trying to sell her house, and it is such a slow process. Yeah.
Phenomenally. And we've got systems lined up and places lined up that needs attention, and I can't give it my attention because first of all, the funds are lacking, which needs to come from the house sale, and then time to go down there and do that. So that's from a personal point of view, that's a little bit. Yeah. I think a business perspective, I'm busy with consulting, and you look at I'm doing work for a variety of companies and entities, and some of them's got this fancy ideas, and they want to run. The old saying, fools rush in where angels fear to tread, comes to mind as well. So first of all, they try to be too fast and then end up being a lot slower because they didn't anticipate all the loopholes and the catches. Not spending the upfront time makes you slower in the end of the day than if you really do it properly and investigate properly. So I think
yes, that's a very interesting balance, because there's certain things that we need to do better in the beginning that makes us slower, but when the project is really then the project can fly. And it's a difficult sell to sell people to understand if they haven't done it themselves.
It is. I think very often it's a case of they being naive and not having the experience in what they're trying to do and believing what fly-by-nights are telling them. Or, I won't say which countries, but some of our manufacturing countries, copying countries, supply processes, and they promise the sun, the moon, the earth, everything, and at the end of the day, they can't deliver. So not knowing where the pitfalls are and not having that experience makes them gullible to a certain extent, and that's why they also run way too fast before getting down to the nitty-gritty and understand what's going on. They're just chasing the money, and sometimes you have to go a little bit slower to go faster.
Absolutely. So, Petrus, we talked about in school school or university, how some teachers can break you or impede your progress, but others can just give you that lift off that you need. Have you seen something similar with managers that you've worked on in corporate and in a smaller company?
Oh, this is dangerous territory.
Oh,
Definitely, I won't call names. That's definitely not going to work. But I think during my career, I've seen areas where people are, I won't say jealous, but what's a good word to use there? Yeah, hang vast aan sy, Elsie.
it's a very competitive business out there. They compete quite a lot sometimes.
Yeah, I think when you look at some people, they don't like you running ahead of them. They would like to stay in control, but they're not always fulfilling their job. Their job is to manage the people under them and not to do the work for them. And thereby, a good manager will take the experience and the get up and go from the employees and utilize that rather than to try and curb it, because they're now outshining, in a certain sense, the manager. And that's not what it should be. I always like to have people that's better than I am, whom I can tell, listen, this is what we need to do. You find out how we do this. I don't care what, I think this is what we have to do, but I don't know how to do it. You get the how, and I'll assist you to get it going.
Yeah, a good manager is not intimidated by the success of people who report to them. I remember my dad always said, when he got into a higher position, that he always trained the people reporting to him to do his job. He said he'll never get promoted if someone else can't do their job. So he was not intimidated by young ones. He would train them to do his job so that he's free to go to the next level. And that worked very well for him. I was not that successful in doing that, but I always thought that was good advice.
Yeah, I do think I managed to get a very good succession plan going all my working career. And I could move ahead and somebody else would pick up after me. And they were trained up to do so. And that definitely works. So I think that is something that's lacking in a lot of managers. And yeah, I see these days that people, and we saw that when we were looking also with OTC on this gas cliff. How many people were like ostriches, head in the sand? No, it's not going to happen. It's not. And we did interviews everywhere and no plan B. So the lack of vision in our managers is very obvious in certain areas. Now, I'm not sure why we got to that point and the discipline that you require to get there. Now, I want to go back to almost my army days. And that taught us discipline, real discipline, from making your bed to shining your boots to everything. And we seem to have a lack of that real discipline and frostbite that we learned in our early years. The early South Africans, our generation, the 70s, 80s generation, had a lot more going for them in terms of tenacity, get up and go, and just do it. I won't repeat Branson's words, but yeah, let's just do it.
I wish I have more of that, but I would not want to go through the army experience to get more of that. But there is something to say there's definitely truth in that many people, and I think sometimes I fall into that pitfall, and I'm trying to not fall into that. But when there's a problem, just wait, someone else will sort it out eventually. I don't have to do anything about it. Which is fine, but then you need to also be okay of losing out. If you're not in the beginning, if you're not making it work, you might just lose out on an opportunity. But I do think there's sometimes a culture of, if I just wait long enough, someone else will sort out this problem.
And then it turns out you're the someone else.
And then it's too late to really do what you... Yeah, the problem is if you wait too long, a proper solution can't be put in place, and it's sometimes a half-baked solution, and it's not as good as it could have been if you are a little bit more proactive.
Yeah, I think a lot of our younger generations also give up too easily and they want to move too fast.
Yeah.
We go back, maybe we took a long time to grow our careers. We spent 3, 4 years in one position. Now they want to move every year. There's something to be said for that, for going ahead and getting ahead. But experience is gained by doing things and doing things wrong sometimes. But to gain experience, you need to be there and see it happening. Your industrial issues do not reoccur every week. Sometimes it takes a long time for certain issues to come up. And if you're not there at the time, you don't get that experience. So I feel that a lot of our young people have ambition. Yes, that's good, but they're pushing too hard to get to the top level without getting the experience to be there. And then you find that you've got lacking leaders at that point.
And it's an interesting mix of this culture that we are in, where things are so readily available. People don't have to wait. I remember as a child where I had to wait for ages in queues. We have very few queues lately where we have to wait. Information is readily available. We don't have to spend hours in a library or try to find old books and stuff to get information. If information is almost too readily available, our biggest job is to go through it and see what's good and bad. So in this new culture of things happening fast, things being everything happens faster apart from selling houses, but all the other things are happening so fast that we get so used to it, and then we think a career can go that fast again. But we need to learn some patience. Patience is lacking, and patience is not waiting for 5 minutes. I've caught myself the other day, I felt impatient and I realized, but I haven't even been waiting for 5 minutes. That's not patience. Patience is waiting for a year, waiting for 2 years for things to happen.
Yeah, and then you've got this AI environment where you get a lot of information on your fingertips, but without experience, you don't know how to judge it and to evaluate it.
That's true. And that's true.
You can easily put out garbage without even knowing it.
Yeah. Now to discern and to choose what's the best information and not just average information. That is definitely where you need some of the experience to have worked on. Probeer nou dink wat wil ek volgende vra. En nou lekker gesels en nou het ek 'n bietjie van al my ander idees wat ek neergeskryf het ek opgepraat. Waaroor kan ons nou nog praat? Ons het nog so 10 minute.
Okay.
So we've talked about bad management, but do you have, and we don't want to call out the bad managers, but is there any good manager that you can call out? And explain to me what it means to be a good manager and experience a story. You are very good at storytelling, so tell me a story about a good manager.
I've got quite a few very good managers. And I think every one of them gave me freedom. One of my first ones was a guy many of you know, Oscar Fortwyn. Oscar was one of my first mentors, leaders, managers. He was the one who told me, once oil gets into your blood, you'll never get it out again. And Oscar, I can't remember incidents specifically, but he was one that immediately comes to mind when I'm talking about good managers. Allowed freedom, allowed lateral thinking, really supported young people spreading their wings and trying to do something different. I did one specific project where, going back to these RCD reactors, I mean, they're massive reactors. The wall thicknesses are 13 inches on those reactors, and then monoclad as well. Now, when you go into a shutdown, running at 420, 430 degrees centigrade, to cool down that reactor with the catalyst inside takes you almost a week. So I visited a conference in America, and there Air Liquide was doing a presentation about liquid nitrogen cool down. Yes, this sounds phenomenal, but you can't just put liquid nitrogen at that low temperature on hot metal, you will cause major problems. So we ran with this project, and I got Oscar to accept it, and he he pushed it forward. So we had a site where we put a lance into the pipeline, and we would introduce liquid nitrogen through that system into a recycling stream and cool down the stream with input from the University of Pretoria. They assisted me in getting thermocouples all around the reactor, different levels. They did a survey of the reactor, so we had thermocouples and we checked what was happening on the outside as well as the inside. We could create a thermal gradients over the reactor shell and stay within approved parameters. It was very, very technical for the time as well. And we managed to shave off, I think it was 4 days of the shutdown time.
Sure. Yeah, because every day is money that you lose, but you have to do the shutdown. You can't get away from it.
You couldn't do anything before the reactors were cooled down. You could get into them. It was the whole system, the heaters, fire heaters, the compressors, everything was in that cool down loop. So shaving off those days shaved off the time from the shutdown, and that gave you 4 days extra. And we had the shutdown every 4 months at the time, so that was 3 times a year. We could do that.
Sure.
That was huge value for money, and I had the full support for something totally radical. That's a good manager. Another one was a Frick. He was in Sasol Fuel Oil, and again gave me free rein. Go and find product wherever you want to go. I didn't have any issues around moving, driving here or there, go and see customers, go and see the refineries on an ongoing basis. I spent 40% of my time in the office, and the rest of the time I was out on the road and seeing suppliers. And he was fully supportive of that. And when I got a way out idea, he would look at it, listen to it, say, okay, show me, make it work. Yes, go for it. And I think that was giving me free reins. Maybe not a good manager for everybody, but he could look after people and determine how much free rein they could manage and could get. He made it easy for me.
No, not micromanaging. Now, the opposite of control. Many people want to control absolutely everything, but then they limit the people who are working for them. Petrus, you said that you have started off building with your dad, and even when you had to make your choices at the end, you thought of civil engineering because you enjoyed the building so much. Is that still in your blood, or has that disappeared over time?
Well, I've just finished a renovation for my son in Hartbeespoort, where we replaced his whole kitchen. We added a loft room. We added a massive parking area with a covered veranda area. So yeah, that was a project we just did now. The house we bought in Mossel Bay, we just finished now last week, replacing doors and windows with double glazing, aluminium frames, new patios, new veranda, new balustrading, everything. So that's another building. And on the farm, I've got an old derelict farmhouse, which we want to convert into a 5-bed guest house. So that's the next one waiting.
I need to get your rates. My dad has always been my go-to when I had building, and now he's not here anymore. So I need to get your rates and see if I can afford you to do some of my renovations.
I think building is so creative. It's almost a blank canvas, and you've got an idea in your head, you put it down on paper, and you go and fix it and make it. And when you're finished,
it's not that easy. You need skills. You need the skill. Hey, there's a lot to say about the skills to make it proper and to make it decent and to make it look good. I mean, I can not just go and do it and make it look good at the end of the day.
There's a lot of help on the internet as well, and go to Pinterest. Pinterest is your go-to to make it look good.
I don't know, Petrus, I do all of those things, but
these loft rooms, I went through maybe 1,000 different loft room designs before we actually finalized our design to make it work.
Oh, cool. Yeah, it's beautiful how people can share and the ideas out there and what's available, and to be creative around that.
Absolutely, yeah. And I say Pinterest is my go-to here. You find so much there. I will go. I'm not so confident on AI yet, but that's the next level of doing it. I just love my Pinterest. I can see pictures and I can see sketches, and they give advice, and it works.
So what other hobbies or creative things are you involved in?
I do woodwork,
Mm-hmm.
cabinet as well as turning. I prefer bowl turning. And then I do what we call live edge bowl turning. So you take it'll be a tree stump, you'll cut a section out of it, cut it through the middle, and then you will turn it sideways. So you've got the bark on the edges of the bowl.
Oh, that's beautiful.
That to me is lovely. It's sometimes a bit scary. You've got big pieces of timber flying around, and you turn what you do what you call air turning. So you only catch the wood every now and then. The rest of the time it's in open air, because you've got a long piece of timber, and when it turns around, you find the edge coming around every quarter turn, and you just knock those off and start to create
and not that the gaps will get the tool in there. Hey, you must be very, very stable with your hand to handle those irregularities.
Absolutely. It's sometimes can be quite scary on big stumps, and they do come loose. They start flying around, and some of them weigh 30, 40 kilograms. Starting turning, I do it slow speed, 600 RPMs. But still, if it comes out of there, it flies around, and it's a heavy piece. My big lathe, I can do 950 millimeter diameters and 450 millimeters deep. I haven't gone there yet because I need a block and tackle in place to get the timber up there. I haven't gone that big yet on that.
I can imagine. Yeah, but you must make beautiful things. I want to see pictures though.
I'll supply related to you. So that's my one. And then the other one is meat processing and hunting. We're only the two of us at home at the moment. We do entertain quite a bit, but the meat doesn't go that far anymore or fast anymore. Especially as you grow older, you don't do 350 gram steaks anymore. It's now back to 150s. Meat tends to last twice as long as it should. So we hunt less and we process less, but we get involved in church fights, and we do meat processing for them for the fights, and get the congregation together as well to assist on that, and that brings people together. So it's another way of getting people to talk to each other. You bring them into the butchery in a very small confined space
something
area,
together,
and all work together, and you start to hear stories, and people start to get to know each other. At church, they see each other every Sunday, but it's just a hello, hi, goodbye. And when you spend time together and you cut your finger and you need to plaster and somebody helps you with the plaster, it brings people together.
It does. I have very good memories of when I was little, and we visited my godparents on their farm in the northern, then it was still northern Transvaal, and Limpopo area. How they would process, how they make wors, how they would make sausages, how they would make biltong. It's a total different story. See, I was too young to really do a lot, but I remember the camaraderie. I remembered coming together, and I remembered seeing the different parts and how it works. And it was incredibly interesting. It's really a different thing to do it yourself than to just buy it from the market.
What's nice about it as well is there's no end on the varieties you can make. This weekend we did chili cheese warthog grillers, smoked them as well. We did some chorizos, smoked chorizos, as well as aged chorizos. We do salamis and all sorts of sausages. The world is so rich.
And at least you know what's in there. That is normally my thing. At least you know what's in there.
Absolutely, yeah. We've even did our own black pudding, which I'm very fond of. Yeah.
Can you
Bloedwors.
No.
Very Scottish, but lovely. And German.
No, I know. Very German as well. I know when I went in Germany, the sausages that you get there is incredible, the variety. But I was not that adventurous to absolutely try everything. What I did love about Germany was their potatoes. I love potatoes. And in Germany, when I was there, every day, for every meal, there was a different form of potato that you could eat. I just loved that. That to me made me excited.
Potatoes and diabetes doesn't go along very well.
No, they don't. But Okay, Petrus, is there anything else that you would like to talk to? Otherwise, I'm going to wrap up.
On the interest side, with the hunting as well, we do our own reloading of ammunition. And that's become a passion as well. It's chasing the ultimate goal of having a sub half-inch MOA. So that's really what it's all about, and getting as accurately as possible.
So what do you mean? I mean, I don't know a lot about that area, but like making your own bullets, is that what you mean?
Okay, the components are basically of a cartridge. It's your bullet, is the killing part, the casing, the brass casing, the powder, and the primer. Primer setting it off at the back. So you've got those four basic components. And it's about getting the ratios of your bullet weights, the depth of the seating of the bullet, and the weight of your powder, and the type of powder. To get all of that to a point where you've got the sweet spot on your rifle. Each rifle basically has its own sweet spot. So you can buy ammunition from the shelf, and it's reasonably okay, but it's okay. Yeah. It's not great. And we strive to be great in terms of that and get a real accurate ammunition. That allows you to take proper shots when you're hunting and make sure of clean kills. You don't let animals suffer. So that's the end goal.
That sounds like a science on its own.
It is. And you determine your trajectories, you determine your muzzle velocities. There's computer programs for that as well now. And at the end of the day, what you get with technology that's been improved so much, you can get telescopes now that's got a custom-made turret. A turret is the top end that you will do the elevation. And a bullet flight will have a parabole. And you can determine then with your specific loading then what that parabole will look like. And then they will...
If you know the distance, you need to know the distance though as well, hey?
You need it, the parabole goes over the distance. So it's the height above your sight line or below the sight. So initially you'll end up below the sight line as your barrel is below the telescope's center. And then you cross the sight line, you go an arc over the cross line, you cross the sight line again, and you start to drop. Now that data you will give the supplier of the telescope, and they will produce you with a turret where you can set a turret at 400 meters and you aim point blank. You don't have to give away or anything. It's all designed into the turret, again, to get as accurate as possible.
Different type of AI, hey?
Now you pay about 65,000 rand for that telescope.
Sure. Yeah, that is a total world on its own, hey?
Yeah, it's lovely. It's very technical, and it's good. It's a fun hobby to have, and you can sit there on your own, go to the workstation, and you will reload, go through all the different steps. You've got to follow them very precisely, and the scales are on a grain level, accurate to 2 decimals.
And as you say, at the end, it's all of that is to help to have a clean shot, that the animal doesn't, what's the word I'm looking for? Suffer, that the animal doesn't suffer too much at the end of the day.
Yeah, I know a lot of people don't like hunting, but I can go into that topic for a long time about the ethics and comparing that to an abattoir.
Yeah, I mean, to hunt for the sake of hunting and just killing an animal doesn't feel good. But the whole idea is to say that I'm using the meat and I'm doing something with it. And as you say, compared to an abattoir where you don't always know what's going on. I listened to this YouTube of a lady, but it seems she's very Asperger. Very high on the scale, but she's a professor, and I think in America, growing up on a farm, seeing how they worked with animals, but she studied something totally different. But now she's designing abattoirs to be cow-friendly, but she doesn't take nonsense, eh? She doesn't take nonsense. She's very, very straightforward. But it was incredible how her mind just worked and how she got very... firstly, where she saw what's really going on, and I've realized half of the time we don't really know what's going on. And secondly, she didn't say no meat due to the cruelty. She said, let's fix this problem of how to do it less cruel and more, is it humane? But humane on animals, that doesn't sound right. But to do it differently, that is more animal friendly. And she had such good results. And now it seems some of her things are used worldwide in what she's developed in the abattoir thing. But I hear you. We can go into a big discussion on ethics. And I think it's so important in any of these things, Beatrice, that we don't judge people, and we take the time to listen and to understand the motivations. Because often when we do that, there's a bigger picture out there that we've never knew and that we've never explored.
So this is discussion on its own. Looking at the merits of even culling, looking at the Kruger and the overpopulation of the elephants, and we've got our greenies and others who are, I won't go into all that now, but we have a problem. We have serious problems, and we need to address those. Otherwise, and you can't say one animal's got a better right to living than the next one. If you destroy all the habitat, the kudu's are going to die off, because they're browsers, they're not grass eaters, they eat leaves. And if you don't have any bush and trees left, the kudus will die. So is the elephant more important than the kudu? There should be a balance. And once you put a fence, I think
so, yeah.
Once you've introduced human intervention and putting a fence around animals, you have to manage them. They cannot.
No, Beatrice, that's true. Now, there's a holistic picture that we can't lose. And I think many times, even if we talk about major struggles in the world, when it comes about humans and human behavior and those things, people tend to hatch on the one small slice of the problem, but they don't realize you can solve a small problem, but if you don't look holistically, you can create 4 or 5 other problems because you didn't look at the whole ecosystem of animals or humans or whatever we talk about. Sometimes we just need to look a little bit further and don't just jump to the thing that seems most obvious.
Or we can take it a bit further and say the main problem is the world is overpopulated by humans. And that's the real problem.
We're not going to call them. Sorry, maybe we must cut that out. Yeah. Let's not go there, but that's going to be an interesting thing on its own. I think we can still, Beatrice, I think there's so many other avenues that we can discuss, and it's going to be interesting. You're a real storyteller, and it's been such I really enjoyed talking to you, and I hope this will not finish. We will keep on talking, but thank you for your time. Any last words from your side?
I think it's a great pleasure working with the team. I find the variety of people within OTC very innovative on one side and very stimulating. Yeah, it's great being part of the team, and it's been great talking to you.
Thank you, Beatrice. Sorry?
We'll take this over a coffee again going forward.
Definitely. This is not the end of that. Thank you. And with that was our interview with Beatrice Scholtz, another of the OTC consultants that I have a privilege to work with. Stay put. You never know who I'm going to interview next time. Looking forward to that. Thank you.